The newly independent United States used Greek Revival architecture as a symbolic affirmation of ancient Greece with its quest for independence and its vital role in the creation of democracy. As many people in Madison grew prosperous, architects displayed that wealth and prominence with such stunning accomplishments as the Lanier Mansion and nearby Shrewsbury House. Today, these buildings stand as monuments to historic preservation.
Well, I think the architecture is kind of a very natural reflection of the growth and decline of a community because it's so integrally related to the economics of the community. As people became wealthy through the industry that was growing here, they wanted to display that in having nice homes to live in. And so you have wonderful residential architecture here from the first half of the 19th century.
From the time that Madison was founded, it grew in spurts for the first couple of decades, I guess. Especially the 1830s and 1840s, that's the period when real estate values were escalating, the population was increasing rapidly. So the building boom didn't really start overnight, in my view. It was just something that grew incrementally.
The architecture was a symbol of economic growth, of the prosperity, of the optimism of the time, and the feeling that things were continually going to get better here in the United States.
Well, as the town grew, the architecture, of course, more buildings were built, and the architecture became larger from log cabins to brick homes, and then to really large homes. The styles were probably slightly behind the East Coast. We had a lot of federal-style buildings here that were here after that style had gone out of fashion on the eastern part of the country.
As those stylistic changes took place nationally, the East Coast was certainly still the most populated, heavily populated, and most urban part of the country at that time. And as those influences were appearing there, they were gradually brought west as people began to cross the Alleghenies and move into the Northwest Territory.
And then the Greek Revival style, which was everywhere in the 1830s and 40s and even into the 50s. And what's interesting about that was almost every building was Greek Revival, and they all looked the same. A bank, a church, a house would all look, you couldn't tell from the outside what kind of a structure it was. They all looked almost exactly alike.
As time progressed on and people hired architects to design them, then kind of the national trends in architecture were reflected, such as the Greek Revival and the Classic Revival, which are reflected here in the Lanier Mansion and the Shrewsbury House.
The difference between Federal and Greek Revival style buildings often can be very confusing, especially if you're looking at a really simple building without a whole lot of ornamentation. But generally speaking, if the building has columns and it's a Federal style building, the columns are going to be real slender, long drawn out columns. If it's a Greek Revival, they're going to be full scale columns like the ones on the Lanier Mansion that are basically almost exactly the way they would have been on a real Greek temple 2,000 years ago.
Lanier played an important role in kind of the financial stability of Madison in the first half of the 19th century. And then when Francis Costigan arrived in Madison in 1837, being trained as well as anyone on the frontier at that time as an architect, Lanier immediately wanted to have this person be the person who designed his house, and he wanted a house that would reflect his increased stature in the community, his wealth and his prestige. And Costigan was the right person at the right time, I guess you could say.
His first big commission was Lanier Mansion, and I think that helped give him a name in the community, and that's probably why he was selected as the architect for the Shrewsbury House, which is nearby. and both those homes gave him a really good reputation.
The Shrewsbury House was able to really push the architectural envelope in terms of the design, in terms of the embellishments, in terms of the windows, in terms of the decorative effects in those houses, and that's one reason why both of those houses are noted as National Historic Landmark properties.
He also designed other public and residential buildings around the community, so he sort of set an architectural standard for Madison that, in that sense, kind of sort of certainly established a level for other people to try to achieve as well.
We learn that many gentlemen, both from Cincinnati and Louisville, who have been out in our place and examined the Lanier Mansion, have said that in the point of architectural beauty and workmanship, it surpasses anything in those cities. And several gentlemen from eastern cities have also acknowledged that they have seen nothing there superior to it. It gives us pleasure to say that the plan of this house was not only designed by our fellow citizen, Mr. Francis Costigan, the builder, but that every portion has been worked to his own hands, much if not all the ornamental work, decoration, etc., on the various parts. We venture to say that there is not in the whole valley a more thoroughly well-built house. The materials are the very best and choicest. The workmanship would be creditable to the best builders of our age. Madison Banner, November 27th, 1844.
I would emphasize that I don't think that there was a single event that anyone can say started a boom as such. It was continued development that gained momentum over a period of time. And even though Madison in some ways declined in the last half of the 19th century, or at least did not develop as rapidly and intensely as it had up to 1850, there continued to be sustained industrial development and new construction really clear up to World War I.
In the second half of the 19th century, Madison's prosperity began to fall off. There wasn't the same level of wealth that there had been in the early 19th century. So the tendency was to retain what people had rather than to demolish it and build something new and what would have been at that point considered more fashionable or current.
The lull in the economy of Madison in the late 1800s was reflected in the fact that there were fewer new structures built in Madison. And also people didn't have the money anymore to remodel their homes. So the structures here in Madison were almost frozen in time for a while.
There's kind of a natural shelf of land that we are in right now at the foot of the hills that sort of provide the backdrop for that shelf. And so that it gave kind of a very definite boundary for the amount of land that could develop. What that meant was that during the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, that shelf increasingly filled up. But in the post-World War II era, when building really took off in a lot of parts of this country, and you have a lot of post-World War II construction, that couldn't take place on this shelf, so it had to take place on what the local residents call the hilltop.
During the late 1950s, when the IKE plant and the growth started on top of the hill, and the economy of Madison started strengthening, there became this push to modernize the buildings downtown. While this was good and it was logical, there were some people, particularly John and Ann Wendell, who came to town and said, wait a minute, what you're covering up are terrifically good examples of 19th century all-American, mid-America architecture. That was the beginning of historic Madison.
There was a threat to some of the architectural heritage of the community. Some prominent citizens got together and decided they wanted to address that, and did. And Historic Madison was the result of that. And that began, I think, the interest in Madison's preservation and architectural history.
I think there were groups like Historic Madison that started in the 1960s that made the local people aware of the importance of maintaining the architecture and preserving it. And I think over the years, somehow, because it also, that people began to realize that it is an economic generator and helps the community that way, and it also makes it special, especially as other towns lost their historic character and all began to look the same, that people became more and more aware of how special the architecture in Madison is, and even the average person here, I think, is aware of that architecture and the worth and the value of preserving it.
This brought education. This brought a stronger awareness of what these buildings are. It also brought guidance and help to some of the business people who really didn't understand what and how to market and how to change and how to live with these historic buildings.
This city, with its hills, river, and broad tree-lined streets, creates an atmosphere of harmony and serenity. It is, however, the diversity of its early architecture, with its overlapping of styles, which give this town its distinct character, immediately recognizable, but difficult to analyze. The late Carl Berg, a former consultant to the City Planning Commission, said it briefly and best when he called it the Madison look. John Wendell.
The 1981 ordinance is an historic district overlay ordinance. And what that means is it is an overlay of the existing zoning ordinance in downtown Madison. And it identifies the downtown district as a special area and imposes on that area limitations or restrictions as it relates to exterior modification and also removal of homes, and also signage in the downtown. All of those things are addressed in the ordinance. In other words, you had to make special application to this board, the Historic District Board of Review, in order to make an exterior change to your home, or to have your sign approved if you were a business, or if you're going to remove a home that was in the district, then you had to make application to do that.
The ordinance in 1981 for the Historic Review Ordinance was basically spearheaded by Historic Madison. They were the ones who worked with the state and the city government in the process of going through the various readings we had to go through in drafting the ordinance. And it was rather contentious at that point. And as the city went through the different readings of this ordinance, there was a lot of angst, a lot of different viewpoints expressed. Well, we should be able to have this, we shouldn't be able to have this. To this day, years later, there are still people thinking that you have to have permission to paint your building. You have to have permission for color. This is totally incorrect. There's still misconceptions about this historic ordinance. What it does is it preserves the fabric. It preserves the look, the ambiance. It makes it more difficult to take down a building.
The 1981 ordinance is still in existence today and still being implemented by the board. The Board of Review is active. They meet, I think, on a monthly basis, and they consider applications today. I think the impact of the ordinance over the years has been to stimulate a lot of downtown investment, private investment. I mean, this is private money. People coming in, buying homes, buying businesses, renovating those properties. You know, so everybody, I think, in town is familiar with the board and knows that they need to make that application if there's a problem.
I think it's important to revitalize and keep these buildings because it's such an important part of who we are as a culture. And I think if we couldn't do that, we would only know of history through reading about it in books, and that certainly doesn't replace the actual experience of these places.
The architecture has now influenced the city. It's become a main part of the economy of the city through the tourism business. Without the architecture here, I don't think Madison would have nearly as many tourists as it does. It's become almost a perfect example of a small town for people to come and see. Almost the whole town is a museum. So for that reason, that helps the economy here and brings the tourist here.
People want to see someplace different, and Madison certainly is very different from most of the modern towns and most 19th century towns that still exist because so much of its early architecture is still intact where in so many places it's been knocked down or remodeled beyond resemblance. And so the architecture says something about not only Madison, but about the United States. And by preserving that, we preserve a link to our early past, not only as a country, but also as a state and a community along the Ohio River.
Through economic hardships and public controversies, the architecture of Madison stands at the forefront of preservation throughout the Ohio River Valley. Inspired by historic preservationist John Windle, Madison has kept its 19th century architecture much like it was in the era of steamboats and Civil War soldiers. Today, the preservation of architecture has become one of the major attractions of Madison, drawing students from throughout the valley for its heritage tourism.